So I'll turn it over to you right now.
Great. I have screen sharing is still disabled, it says. Host disabled participant screen sharing. I know it worked a few minutes ago, so.
Sorry, I forgot you left and then you came back, so I have to give you your superpowers back. So here you
Gotcha.
go. Now,
thank you.
Dr.
Awesome.
Ihde, thank you.
Okay, hopefully you're seeing the right screen when I share this. Are you seeing the full presentation mode?
We are, yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for that great introduction and for having me here tonight, everybody. Thanks for coming. I will be talking about oysters and oyster reefs and the ecology that they support, the ecosystem that they support. Before I get into that, and I'll talk about some results from a study, I did want to mention that my co-author is also on the calls, Dr. Scott Kanaki, who is a natural resource economist and the director of Pearl. So he is on the call as well. And we'll be getting into a results of a study that we did together and introducing a study that we're about to embark on that's actually in Virginia. And on the note of Virginia and Maryland, throughout the talk, I'll be mentioning one or the other or both together as Chesapeake Bay. But I know your interests are focused in Maryland, but everything I do is about the system and about working with the system dynamics. And our system is, of course, Maryland and Virginia's Chesapeake Bay together, and all the tributaries as well. So each of the tributaries are their own systems, but they all work together, and that's what my work is focused on is computer modeling of the entire system, or in the case of the study I'll talk about tonight, about one of those tributaries, the Chop Tank and Little Chop Tank, referred to as the Chop Tank Complex oftentimes, and that's its own little subsystem. So without further ado, we'll be talking about oysters and the services they provide. And when I say ecosystem services, it's kind of a jargony term, but it is. So do I need to allow Richard to enter the room, or can you still do that?
No, I'm still managing that. Go ahead.
Okay, it showed up on my screen. So I just want to make sure I wasn't excluding anybody. So some of those ecosystem services include the fantastic capacity of oysters to filter the water. And when they do that, they're taking out suspended solids from the water column, which allows other things to grow. In specifically, very important to our system are the submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV. Without removing all those particulate problems in the water column, sufficient light doesn't get down to let the SAV grow. So it's a pretty important function for oysters, but they don't act alone either. There's a lot of filter feeders in the bay, but many of them are facilitated by oysters, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. They denitrify, they increase the rate of denitrification in the system. So removing some of those nitrogens and species into nitrogen gas, and then it can escape the system. And they sequester both carbon and nitrogen in their tissues and their shell. Shoreline stabilization is really an important function. With climate change and sea level rise issues, we're really missing our oyster reefs in the Chesapeake Bay. We've got to create artificial reefs in many locations. People usually use riprap. to take the place of those oyster reefs that used to protect our shores. Of course, there's oyster restoration going on as well. But to a large extent, we're just missing that former stabilization the Chesapeake used to have. And as they grow, they produce a complex habitat that benefits many, many species that can live within the reef itself. They are, because of that, they're often referred to as ecosystem engineers. Sometimes a keystone species, people will refer to them as. I prefer the term foundational species because they really do provide the structure that so many other species depend on, not only for the habitat, but for the surface area that they provide for other things to grow on. Without that surface area, many areas of the Chesapeake are too silty for our filter feeders to grow. So many of the other filter feeders like mussels and barnacles and sea anemones rely on the surface provided by those oysters. So when envisioning, trying to think back, as I know your group often does, in trying to envision the environment that used to be here before we lost the majority of our oyster population is extremely difficult. So one of the things I tried to do was to find some quotes of historical documents, historical people that made scientific observations or just happenstance observations, so we could get a better picture of what the system used to be. Back in 1612, Mr. William Strachey had recorded a little bit of a gem here, that oysters there be in whole banks and beds, and those of the best. I've seen some 13 inches long. That's hard for us to imagine that this was a common occurrence to see these large oysters. Typically now, we don't see oysters larger than 3 inches because we harvest them all. You know, that's a good size to sell. So that is what we see now. And when they get longer than that, they're gone, either from harvest or disease. In nearly 100 years later, a Swiss visitor to the Chesapeake recorded the abundance of oysters. It's incredible. There are whole banks of them so that the ships must avoid them. They surpass those in England by far in size. Indeed, they are 4 times as large. I often cut them in 2 before I can put them into my mouth. So even 100 years later, they were still very, very large. And the hazard to navigation is something that's hard for us to imagine. If you've ever been to the St. Mary's River, you can start to imagine that because there's enough reefs and enough oyster structure in what could be imagined throughout the Chesapeake Bay to be a hazard to navigation. St. Mary's River is a pretty neat place if you haven't been there. And the range of the oyster in the Chesapeake used to be much more extreme than it is today. The areas that I'm going to point out on this map are now fairly fresh, and too fresh to support oyster recruitment. The circled area is Man-o-War shoals. That is the largest relic deposit of oysters that we have in the Chesapeake Bay, but too fresh today to support a population. This area further south in the Potomac River is quite fresh as well. This was from this picture was from a survey that happened earlier this year at that spot from the Potomac River Fisheries Commission, dredging up what looked to be contemporary oysters, but it's in an area that's no longer supportive of an oyster population, a relic reef, and the salinity at the time of their observation was about 0.01 parts per thousand. And this area does get saltier. It gets up to about 5 parts per thousand in part of the year, but we just can't support oyster recruitment there any longer. Even up until the 1900s, the harvests were still massive. And this image is from Virginia. It's from Hampton, Virginia. J.S. Darling and Son was a large oyster processor and planter. They distributed the oyster shell after they shucked them, but not only for human use to seed more oysters in the system, which we've been doing for a very long time, but also for roads and sidewalks. And a lot of that material was used for land purposes and has essentially taken those out of the equation for more than 100 years. But what we're seeing are mountains of oyster shell behind their processing plant. These are estimated to be 50 feet high. And this is a common picture that you'll see in the historical documents of what the oyster industry used to be. Solomon's Island, a little closer to home. The island itself is made from the oyster shell, from oyster processing. So that's an artificial island, entirely composed of oyster shell. It's not a huge island, but it's pretty impressive that they made it out of oyster shell at the mouth of the Patuxent River. So with all this harvest, as you can imagine, there was a pretty steady decline. As new gears were introduced, we more effectively harvest those animals. And right around 1880 was the peak harvest, where we had 15 million bushels of oysters harvested. And that translates to about 120 million pounds of oyster meat. And ever since then, it's been a steady decline, or relatively steady. Around 1930 to 1950, things evened out a little bit at a relatively low level of harvest compared to what the population used to be. But then in the 1950s, the hydraulic patent tong was introduced. And simultaneously, we had the population attacked by two new diseases, dermo and MSX, parasites on the oysters that really knocked down the population even further. And it continued to decline until present, where we're at less than 1% of the historical population that remains. So with that, and the recognition that they provided so many benefits to the system, there has been more and more concern and efforts to try and restore, at least on some scale, on the scale of a tributary, some of these oyster populations, so we could again see some of those benefits in the Chesapeake Bay. It's still not at a scale where the entire bay sees a benefit, but these tributaries certainly have seen benefits. And there are 10 of these tributaries that have been identified and cooperatively worked on by the Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, and both states have invested to restore 10 tributaries. The goal is 10 by 2025. And they've made good progress on that. And the study I'm going to be talking about that Scott and I worked on is focused in on 3 of those projects in this Choptank River complex, it's referred to as. So it's the Choptank River and the Little Choptank River on the eastern shore. And that study was a collaborative work between Pearl and NOAA. And these are the 4 authors of the main study. Our goals were to develop a model of the restored system. And in that system, link the results of that modeling effort to an economic impact model. So 2 models we're talking about. One is called EcoPath with EcoSim. That's a trophic model, all about the food dynamics, the predator and the prey that are in these different systems or altered systems. And then using IMPLAN is what the economic impact model is called, to estimate ecosystem services and put those model outputs in terms of dollars and jobs, which people care about. And we did that across a range of scenarios, a range of modeled scenarios that would be the result, or at least what we project would be the result of different oyster restoration policy options. And of course, we compare those amongst the results, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But in a little flow chart here, this is the 2 models, EcoPath with EcoSim. We get outputs from that in terms of biomass. We have to convert the biomass to value. And that's what IMPLAN does. And there's an intermediate step where we had to develop our own custom cost functions, because the model wasn't equipped off the shelf to do that for the Chesapeake Bay. Our fisheries are small scale fisheries, and the IMPLAN model is really developed to work with industrial fisheries in the Northeast originally. And those are 100-foot, 150-foot vessels, sometimes 200-foot vessels with dozens and dozens of people as crew. Very different situation in the Chesapeake, of course. We're talking about oftentimes single operator vessels. Sometimes there's a crew of 1. Sometimes there's a crew of 2. In the most extreme cases, we got a handful of people working together. So we developed this translation so we could use the IMPLAN model, and our outputs again were in terms of jobs and dollars. Managers care about those metrics. The 3 scenarios we looked at was the center one here is can you see my cursor? Can you see my my little arrow there?
I cannot see a cursor.
Okay, so I'll just describe it. So the middle scenario, we're talking about the young restored reef. So that's our current situation. In this system, we have young restored reefs that we just restored a few years ago. And we predict the landings output over a 15-year period and translate those outputs with IMPLAN into the economic outputs of jobs and money. We compare that status quo or current scenario to the one on the left, which was really before these reefs were installed. It doesn't mean there's no oysters there. There are oysters. They're just not in a reef structure. And these are the oysters that are currently harvested. And then the landing output from that particular model scenario also gets translated by IMPLAN into jobs and money. And the third scenario on the far right is a mature restored reef. So this is what we envision as a reef that has been allowed to grow for another 10 years. It develops into further complexity. There's more surface area for more filter feeders to grow. There's more filter feeder biomass also doing the work of clearing the water column. And we take those commercial landings outputs, that's what we're mainly dealing with, commercial fisheries here, and simulating how they would do with these future populations that we're simulating. And IMPLAN translate those outputs, just like in the other two scenarios, to jobs and money. And what we're looking at here is the Maryland portion of the Chesapeake Bay, and the yellow areas and the green areas represent the areas that are productive for oyster harvest and the areas open to oyster harvest. And the green areas are those that were ruled to be sanctuaries back in 2009 because Maryland wanted to recognize the value of oysters in those areas and allow them to grow without harvest so we could see some of the ecosystem benefits in the state. That was a pretty controversial move because it took out a larger portion of what was currently harvested by the oyster harvesters. And of course, there was a lot of argument and political back and forth about that. The end result was by 2010, 24% of the remaining oyster habitat was no longer harvestable. And that's where these new oyster restoration sites have been established in some of those green areas, not all of them. We are talking about just what's in the blue box here. Again, the Choptank River and the Little Choptank River, which is a little bit on the south side. First step to doing a simulation of this system is developing the ecology of that system. And that ecology includes the fishermen and the fishing industry itself, including recreational fishers, gill net fishers, pike net fishers, pound nets, fish pots, eel pots, hook and line fishers, and trot lines. These are at the top of the food chain. On the left, we see the trophic level, the estimated trophic level of the model. At 1, we have producers. 2, we have primary consumers or secondary producers, they're called. At the top, level 5, we have the top consumers. And between 4 and 5, we see almost all the harvesters, and close to level 4 are the top predators in the system. The nodes are a combination of biomass and energy transfer in this diagram. So it's a little bit abstract, but essentially the bigger the node, the more energy is going through that group. So the most energy we see at the bottom of this chart are the producers, and even detritus is considered a producer because animals do eat the detritus on the bottom and consume that with their prey sometimes as well. But what we're looking at are a group of relatively large nodes that's just above 2, about 2.5, 2.2, 2.5 on this trophic level scale. And most all of these guys are filter feeders. So oysters, of course, we do see here. Oysters A is adult oysters. Oyster J is juvenile oysters. Now, juvenile oysters are often about the size of an eraser head, right? Very small, flat, crusty things on rocks. And as it turns out, those little crusty things on rocks are pretty popular as a food item. So a lot of energy gets transferred through animals that eat baby oysters. So even before they're adults, they're very important as a group. So they're treated separately in this model. We model both of them. But here, once the oysters grow, we have surface area for barnacles to grow, hook mussels to grow, things like tunicates, very important. All of those things are filtering with the oysters. And in fact, hook mussels can actually filter a larger water capacity than the oysters can. So until you have that oyster surface area, you don't have those magnified benefits. That's why it was my favorite in your exercise at the beginning. Not because they're the best filter out there, but because without them, you don't get most of these guys. So our harvested data is established from 2006 to 2015 in the base model. So this is actual data from Maryland DNR for all the different fisheries that are active in these tributaries. So 2015 is our starting point for simulations for the next 15 years. And that's what's being compared. In all the comparisons you'll see in the results, that's the last year of the simulation that's being compared, okay? Not the transitory years in between, it's that last snapshot of what's going on 15 years later. In our three scenarios that we just talked about, current young restored reef, mature reef that's been allowed to mature for quite a few years after the restoration took place, and then what would be the scenario if we never did the restoration? The results, we could look at 45 different groups, okay? I'm just looking at one that we're gonna focus on tonight, and that's the adult blue crabs and the harvest of those adult blue crabs. These are the three scenarios that we just talked about. Young reef, these are observations before the blue hash line. And then after the blue hash line are simulations. Things stabilize relatively quickly and then essentially become relatively steady state. In the mature reef scenario, that doesn't happen. After that initial balancing, internal balancing of the model itself, we see a fairly steady increase in biomass and harvest. Subsequently, we've got more biomass, we've got more harvest that takes place in the model. And that's pretty steadily increasing. And beyond the 15 years of the simulation, it would continue to increase, is what's predicted by our model. And when there's no reef, we also, have blue crab out there. And they also stabilize relatively quickly. And what's hard to see in this particular comparison is the difference between the young reef and the no reef scenario. And so I put them side by side the other direction. And what we see then is the young reef, the newly restored reef. The steady state, not the steadily increasing. I wanted to compare those, and we see more biomass being harvested of this species. It doesn't look like a lot, but as you'll see in a minute, that's pretty significant difference between these two scenarios. So as I said, there's plenty of species being harvested here, and I only put 5 of those species in this chart because those are the 5 probably the most important fisheries in this system, and the differences we see between the 3 scenarios. In each of these scenarios, they're being compared to the current young reef scenario. So of course, compared to itself, it's all zeros. But a mature oyster reef is compared to the current young reef, and the no reef is compared to the current young reef. And I'm going to focus in on these 2 fisheries. A trotline fishery is just blue crab. That's all they catch. And the gillnet fishery catches a mix of fish species, and probably most notably white perch, because that's a very popular fish species for both commercial and recreational harvesters. And what we're looking at here are the percent change or the percent difference from the current young reef scenario. 44% for the gillnet is equivalent to about $100 million to the fishery. And if there's no reef, there was a minus 14% change. Again, about a minus $100 million. And that sounds like a lot, but I'm sorry, not 100 million, $100,000. So it's 0.1 million. So it's $100,000. I'm sorry. and minus $100,000. It sounds like a lot, but when it's divided up amongst multiple fishermen and multiple operations, it's really not that much. These are differences, of course, from the young reef scenario. But when we go over to the trot line and look at those numbers, we're on a different magnitude. The mature oyster reef is an increase of about $4 million to the fisheries. Now, that's a pretty substantial increase. And the no reef scenario is about a $2 million loss compared to the current young reef that we have. So now we're on a different scale. And as it turns out, when you look at things in summation, this trotline fishery is by far overwhelming the results of all our other results, like the white perch. Although they're important, they're nowhere near as important economically as the trotline. The economic metrics, once we take those dollars and put them into Implan, Implan cranks out 4 different economic measures that the managers can consider. One of those is sales output. And so that those numbers include the landings that we just talked about, but then also the respending of the dollars that result from those landings in the regional economy, as well as the income experienced by the operators and their crews and how they spend their money in the regional economy. So that sales output is the total of all of that money. Labor income is fairly self-explanatory. And these are not mutually exclusive. So there's overlap between these metrics. Labor income, we just talked about being part of, or at least some of the spending is considered in this first metric, right? Value added is analogous to gross domestic product. Employment is a little more intuitive. It's just the number of jobs that result. So we're going to be looking at each of those output metrics here. Sales output, when we're comparing now, we're comparing the mature reef compared to the young reef. About $10 million more in sales output for the region. And by the region, we're talking mainly the 2 counties, Dorchester and Talbot counties on the eastern shore. Labor income, an increase of about roughly 5 million, a little shy of $5 million. Value added, and these are, by the way, these are annual numbers. So these are changes annually. So that's a big deal. Value added, roughly $8.6 million, and about 183 jobs, 183 more jobs when we let the reef mature. And all the fish that take advantage of that are harvested. And that's the differences that we're looking at here, is what's coming into the economy of the region. If we compare the more extreme situations, the mature reef to no sanctuary or our status quo before any restoration took place, we're talking about nearly $23 million a year in sales output increase, labor income, a little over $9 million, value added almost 16 million, and about 360 jobs, more jobs than we had if we didn't restore anything. And then there's what economists produce also is a multiplier effect, an estimate of how much more dollars are produced for each dollar of dockside sales. And what Implan predicts is an additional $1.03 for each dollar of dockside sales So looking specifically at this first metric, I'm going to break things down a little bit differently. So these are the same outputs for the same scenarios, just looked at a little bit differently. So the three scenarios on the left, we're now looking at a total effect of $23 million from, again, just sales output. That's by restoring the reef. The value is $23 million. Now, there's still value if you don't do a restoration, because oyster harvest is still continuing. There's plenty of activities with the other fisheries being harvested. But that is about $10 million, or a difference of about $13 million less than if we have this restored reef in this region, the Choptank region. If we allow that restoration to continue, our models are estimating that the total effect would be about $33 million annually. And the difference from the current young reef scenario would be about $10 million a year. So in summary, there's a substantial increase in commercial fishing related benefits economically to the region with the restoration, and even more with the mature, allowing that restoration to mature. There's a substantial reduction in those benefits, those financial benefits to the fishermen, if we don't do the restoration. Our model estimates focus on the commercial harvesters' sales and backward link supply chain effects. This gets a little jargony here, but this does not include a lot of other benefits that could also be estimated with a different tool. The inclusion of all the filter feeders, not just the oysters, was very important in these modeled effects. There was about 11 to 17% change when we compared to scenarios where we didn't include all the filter feeders and just the oysters. The blue crab and the white perch harvest change drove most of those economic impacts, but the bulk of it really was blue crab. Multiplier effect was $2.03. So an extra $1.03 for each dollar generated through dockside sales. Very briefly, because I know I'm running long on time here, the next project we're tackling is in Virginia, doing essentially the same study, but it's a very different situation. Because Virginia is saltier, there's a lot more oysters to start with. And they also have true seagrass, eelgrass in Virginia, that we lack up here because we're generally too fresh for it to survive. And it's a cold water species. So there's also similar economic benefits to the regions from seagrass habitat, just like oyster reef habitat. But the difficulty there is we're expecting that seagrass to be extirpated soon, because the water temperature is increasing so rapidly that this species is no longer going to survive in this region. And we know this is going to occur. So what we're estimating in this work in Virginia with 2 new students that just started with us are not only the benefits of oyster restoration, which we expect to be smaller in Virginia because there's already oysters there, many, many oysters more than we have in Maryland. But also we're calculating what are we expected to lose with that seagrass. So that's the gist of that study in a nutshell, is a similar sort of work, but with added dimension of seagrass. And there we're focused on the Patuxent River and the York River are the 2 systems we're developing models for, just like we did in the Choptank. So a few references that I cited, and I just want to thank you all for your attention and for having me here tonight. And hopefully I have a few minutes to answer some questions if you have any.
Yep, thank you so much, Tom. If you want us to come stop share, and we'll come back together so we can ask some questions. This was a really interesting way to look at oysters, and I'm fascinated by it. Let's see. I have you spotlighted.
Yeah, Scott may want to chime in too, if Dr. Kanaki, if that's possible.
Sure, absolutely.
Maybe you can
Where is
allow him that access.
There he is. Let me just make you a host. Remove the spotlight. All right, Scott, what can you share with us?
Oh, I thought I was on standby to answer some questions.
That's
So.
all I intended. So if there's some specific economic questions, I'm going to defer to Scott.
All right, do we have any questions for our group? If you want to raise your hand and unmute, you can do that, or we can put it into the chat box. Let me see what's going on. Anybody have their hand raised? I'm looking.
Don't be bashful. Fire away.
You know,
I actually see a question: how do bivalves make reefs?
Okay.
Randy asked. I don't know when, maybe a while ago. Sorry, I didn't see it earlier. So they make reefs because as the animals grow, they deposit limestone essentially, and they just expand as they grow, and their neighbors are busy expanding too, and the reef develops relatively quickly. When they spawn in the right conditions in the spring, oftentimes in Maryland, we don't see recruitment here because we just don't get salty enough. But there are good years where recruitment takes place, and they're broadcast spawners, just like coral. The male and female gametes are floating around in the water, form zygotes. And as they grow, as the zygote grows, eventually they settle out, but they have to have hard substrate to do that. So oftentimes they settle on the animals that originated the gametes to begin with. And so your reef builds over time and increases in complexity. So thanks for that question.
So Tom, Molly has a question that I also kind of had. Does mature reef model cost benefits include the costs and benefits of getting to that point, or estimate what it would look like? So, I mean, what are they taking into consideration? The losses of income, the losses of output economics during the time period between no reef and mature reef? That's what I had, and I'm not sure if that's what Molly was looking at too, but I'm.
So it's a more complicated picture than that. What we used, our tool doesn't estimate cost benefits. And I'm sure Scott is gonna expand on that a little more, but our tool is estimating economic impacts, which is a little bit different. Scott, take it away.
Well, so I may have to throw it back to you a little bit, Tom, on this one, but I think what they're talking about is foregone oyster harvesting revenues. So can you speak to that? Like, I mean, there's this great bump that we're seeing in blue crab harvest, but there is also, like, in a no reef scenario, at least while it's like, you know, and maybe this is a challenge of the time dimension of ecopath, but when you open that mature reef or a young reef, you open that to harvest, the harvester's going to come in, make some money, but then deplete it, and then it kind of hits like some kind of lower baseline of revenues into the future. So yeah, Tom, you could probably
So,
speak to that better than I can.
yeah, that is definitely a different dimension
Mm-hmm.
that we don't capture very well, because we're forcing the oyster population to change. That's what we're forcing in the model. We're forcing the model to have more oyster biomass. And because of that, we can't really look at the oyster harvest change in the oyster fisheries themselves. We estimate it, but basically it's not very interesting. It stays static across our scenarios because we force those changes to occur. And it's not really very interesting because we said, okay, there's 10 times more oysters here now. So there's 10 times more harvest until they're gone. And after 15 years in a scenario where we don't maintain a sanctuary, we're back to the pre-condition before we put the oyster restoration in. And that dynamic does happen in the model, but it's pretty uninteresting because it just declines to the previous state. I don't really think I'm answering your question though.
Well, maybe I could jump in too and just note that, with oysters, and this is kind of relevant to the previous question of how oysters build reefs. When you harvest oysters, you harvest their own habitat. So you can really deplete a population, down to not being able to quite low, a very low level where they really have a hard time increasing because there's no reef structure left. There's no elevated structure off the bottom. The ones that do spawn, the larvae, land on the sediment or the silt and don't, build these reefs that can then be harvested. So there is that aspect too. Whereas with blue crab, over harvesting could be an issue with any species, of course, but you're not harvesting the habitat when you take out blue crab or you take out fish. So it's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison. Furthermore, blue crab are by far the most lucrative fishery in the state of Maryland. They account for about 70% of total dockside values in a given year. While oysters are a little bit on the upswing now, we're talking very small beans in the public fishery. It's I think around $5 to $6 million a year, depending on the year, and dockside values. And blue crab is $50 million, 45 to 50 to 55, could be up to $60 million. So there is some trade-off. Is the bottom line. If you're not gonna allow oysters to be harvested, then there's foregone revenue, but that would be dwarfed, presumably, by the increases in blue crab harvest and revenue.
And Molly wanted to follow up with her question. Also wondered if the model included things like additional jobs created in the efforts of the restoration. So green.
Excellent. I just want to jump in and take a stab at this because I was considering actually just throwing it out there too. Is that's one of the things that makes this project so interesting and we did do that actually, and that was a separate part of this project, but it's really quite uninteresting for a couple of reasons. Like, yeah, you spend money building these massive reefs, 900 plus acres of reefs. You could have spent money building a bridge. You could have spent money building, new water treatment plants, or you could have spent money doing a lot of things for the environment. Any way you spent that money would have generated regional economic impacts. You actually could have dropped that money from a helicopter. People would have collected it and then spent it, and then that money flows through the regional economy. And then you have regional economic impacts. Why this study is I'm biased because Tom and I, did it, but it's neat because we're looking at the regional economic impact increase through these commercial fishing benefits that occur because of the oyster restoration, those would not have occurred without the oyster restoration. So it's not just counting money we're spending on a construction project, which you see all the time in the news about, and you see it now with stimulus packages, et cetera, and economic impacts projected from that. But we're looking at the change in the ecosystem and resulting economic impact. So we did do both, but this by far is the more interesting effort that we described here.
Adrian asks, what do you see as something that would move the needle in terms of water quality and reef quality? So kind of other than restoration, the restoration efforts, I assume.
Other than restoration, less people. People are part of the equation. You know, our big cities are part of the equation for the Chesapeake Bay, and that just means we have to work harder all the time. Less septic, more water treatment plants.
Agriculture too. Could move the needle. Different crop management techniques.
There's
less
a lot of the
fertilizer.
a lot of the low hanging fruit has already been picked for improving ag. It's not like they're not trying. They are, and they often get blamed for a lot of the problems. But it's probably half and half. And we do need to eat. So I don't consider ag bad guys. A lot of them are trying very hard to make improvements and get rid of runoff and not let their cows in the streams, and have the best practices for tilling or no tilling. So a lot of folks are trying very hard out there, but we keep getting more people moving to the coast. We keep building more houses. We keep adding more septic. So
then the people need to eat, and then we need more crops, need more farms, and there's no bad. I don't think there's bad guys or good guys per se. It's just it's just a matter of these are externalities. Economists describe these as externalities, and you're producing something we need. We need food, but there's something else that's produced in the process when we're producing chickens or producing crops, and in the bay.
And there's no easy solutions.
In fact, the needle is moved on in terms of agriculture because of the massive amounts of work that the ag community has done. In fact, more of the pollutant inputs into the waterways are coming from more of the suburban impervious surfaces and the increased runoff and things like that.
Well, we just heard in the news. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, we just heard Baltimore got a black eye. Two of its water treatment plants were broken for quite a while and not inspected properly. So for years, we've had more inputs of sewage than they're really allowed to have. So, I mean, people are going to try to cheat.
Let me have just a question. Let me see here. INSA, since we're talking about pollutants and coming into the water, and we talked about the ecosystem benefits in the beginning of oysters as a filter and how their existence increases the existence of more filter feeders. What happens to the toxins of bivalves that they filter out of the water? Is it safe to eat them?
They do monitor bivalves very closely for toxins. Now, that's some toxins. There's a whole class of toxins that people are just now becoming more and more aware of that have been around since the 50s. But as it turns out, there's some preliminary work that suggests oysters in particular may not be as susceptible as other seafood to some of these toxins like PFAS. And that just may be a quirk of how they function. But there is a lot of concern about many toxins that aren't necessarily on our radar. The ones you're usually concerned about with bivalves is harmful algal blooms and toxins that are produced by algae that they consume. So that's monitored extremely closely. But I wish there were more monitoring of other toxins that were just now coming on people's radars.
So there's something else too on that end, is the microplastics that is getting a lot of press nowadays, and whether filter feeders are more susceptible to accumulating that in their body.
Question.
Yep.
Yeah.
So and there's some, and I'm no expert in this. I'm the economist, remember? But so I've asked a couple folks who are a little more in the know, and they say yes. That there is some emerging evidence that filter feeders do accumulate things like microplastics at potentially a higher rate than non-filter feeding organisms. And our laboratory just received $1 million from NSF to do microplastics research, and our oyster researcher will be looking into potentially that and other aspects of the interplay between microplastics and oyster feeding.
Yeah, because those questions hadn't been asked, we don't really have answers yet. So we look forward to having that particular answer. But oysters are really good at filtering out only the things that they want. But microplastics are so minuscule that we suspect that they are ingesting more as they become more prevalent.
Sue has a question. In the upcoming study in Virginia with SAVs, will you be monitoring the economic harvest of menhaden?
Monitoring the economic, say that again, cost? Say that again, I'm sorry.
Will you be including the menhaden harvest in your economic assessment?
So, menhaden harvest are an industrial fishery that actually doesn't occur in the tributaries we're modeling. It occurs in the main stem of the bay and outside the bay. So they wouldn't be, they're physically not there for us to model in the particular question we're pursuing. So no, they're not part of that. They're not part of the York or Pamunkey, Piankatank rivers.
Ralph wants to know, could you restate the purpose of this seminar? And I don't know if that's for me or for our presenters, because this is we're talking about oysters, we're talking about restoration, we're talking about economics. This is a different way that we're looking at a natural history topic, and so I'm gonna turn that over back to Tom.
So the main thing we wanted to do is share the results of our studies and the next steps, what we're doing next. You know, we didn't really have much time to go beyond that. That's why I just had a cursory review of the history in the bay and their ecology and their importance to the ecosystem. They are important to harvesters for sure, but our focus is really on their importance ecologically that supports the other fisheries. So that, you know, is there a particular aspect of that I could maybe delve into a little more, Ralph?
Ralph, you're mute. Okay.
Yeah, I was just trying to come away with something. I understand what all you talked about, but I'm not sure where it's leading to. You know, I feel like I'm hanging out, but I don't have any real ultimate goals or where it's going with all the efforts that you're putting in.
Where our projects are going,
Yes.
or where tonight's talk is going.
No, well, where the projects are going, but how this tonight's talk is explaining where you're trying to go.
So as Scott mentioned earlier, there is a lot of investment. There's a lot of societal investment when it comes to restoration. People are spending a lot of money. And without some kind of documentation of, hey, is there a bang for the buck or not? That's what our study's all about, is just, you know, financially, should we be doing this? And our study suggests that, you know, there are serious financial gains for the region versus not doing it. And that was the crux of our studies, both past and future. So that's maybe Scott can add to that.
Yeah. So the resource managers and policymakers are really hungry for economic information about environmental restoration. And that's why our project was funded, to explore that, to understand that. And, you know, when we were going in, we weren't sure whether blue crab or what species would show benefit, but the modeling effort led by Tom shows that blue crab are expected to increase substantially through this restoration. The resource managers and policymakers were, you know, all over this, and they wouldn't have been probably they certainly would not have been nearly as excited if we showed just a large increase in white perch and several $100,000 a year. Like, we're seeing big increases in blue crab, and then very big, in the millions of dollars annually, increases in revenues for commercial fishers. And that brings me to point two, which is one of the, I think, benefits of our project and outcomes is showing folks that environmental, like, and there's different stakeholders in the Bay, right? There's a Save the Bay crowd, the environmentalists, there's the commercial harvesters. Let's go out there and get the critters and sell them at the dock. And they all want more animals in the Bay, but they see different ways to get there, right? And with our research showing or predicting that there'll be these big increases, large increases in blue crab in this certain area, that can potentially help to assuage the concerns of a group of folks that can be quite antagonistic to environmental restoration, and that's the commercial fishers. So, and these commercial fishers, they're fishing for oyster, they're fishing for blue crab, they're fishing for striped bass, and if they see that, okay, well, I can't harvest oyster here anymore, and that's a shame, but there's likely to be large increases in blue crab if this reef continues to mature, then that could help them say, all right, you know, this makes sense, and I can be on board on this, you know, and on support restoration projects like this that benefit me, the commercial fisher, and not just the environmentalist, right?
It is important to mention, though, that everybody's not going to benefit, right? If our predictions are anywhere close to reality, doesn't really matter for the oyster harvesters. They're going to have less area to harvest. Now, the reality is they're building in sanctuaries that are already marked off. So that may not be an issue. But it's always trade-offs. There's always some that benefit, some that don't.
But I'll push back on that a little bit. Let me push back a little bit at the time. Is the vast majority of oyster harvesters are also trot lining for blue crab.
Well, they're
getting hit in one area. They're getting hit in one spot, but they're benefiting in another area.
That is, yeah, the caveat I was about to mention is that there are some oystermen that only harvest oysters, but they are few and far between. The majority harvest multiple species, and almost everybody we interviewed harvest crabs also. So that is important.
That's kind of a good segue into what agencies or offices will be using your findings.
So in the Chesapeake Bay, there's joint management of some species. The blue crab is one of those species. The states manage them together, and NOAA has a seat at the table also, even though it's not their jurisdiction. So they participate along with Maryland and Virginia for crab management. For fish management, it's all about Maryland and Maryland DNR. Except for 1 or 2 species that are managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. So whoever of those groups, depending on what species you're talking about, that's the group that would use the outputs of this model. Okay. The NOAA Chesapeake Bay office is who actually funded us. So I hope they use it.
I have a question. I mean, just coming from a science background and understanding ecology, it seems like it would make sense that if we restore the oyster reef, understanding what they provide, you would see this. And I know that you have to find the data and have that to show other people and to prove the point. One of the things I found interesting was how lopsided it was to just the blue crab versus the other species, where the other species increases were not as significant than the blue crab. And is there any idea why you see it so weighted to the blue crab and not other fisheries?
Yeah, it's just the price. They're the most expensive by weight. They're most valuable, lucrative fishery by weight, by far.
Yep. So Tom, maybe we could shed some insight into one thing that was a little that was unexpected, perhaps. Is there was a negligible, actually very slightly negative effect on striped bass,
right?
Rockfish, and
yeah,
that was surprising. So these models are highly complex, Tom. You know, these ecological models. There's so many things going on. I mean, Tom, do you have like best guesses as to why blue crab benefited and striped bass didn't?
Oh yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, that comment, Scott. So Scott made a comment earlier that's really important to understand is there is no foregone conclusion here. We didn't expect blue crab to benefit. Looking back, you know, having the knowledge of how the predictions worked out, well, it does make sense. Yeah, but we didn't go into it expecting blue crab to have this disproportionate effect on the result. They could have gone down. You know, their main habitat they depend on is seagrass. So that's not in the model. We didn't model habitat benefits of them being able to sit down in the crevices of the oyster reef either. We didn't include any of those kind of aspects. This is strictly that they benefited because their prey benefited. And there's a variety of prey that increased because of the changes we forced on the system. We forced the system to have more oysters, and that increased the surface area, which allowed other filter feeders to be there that they eat. And one of those, one of the primary prey that they eat was mud crab. And mud crab are not forced to benefit, but again, because we increase their prey by allowing the more filter feeders to be there, that's what the mud crab love to eat. And so the blue crab were benefiting from eating some of the filter feeders themselves, and also from the things that eat the filter feeders beside the blue crab, the mud crab. So they're benefiting in a couple different ways just by having more food available. And we didn't anticipate that at all. So that was a pretty interesting outcome, and just surprised us just as much as it did other people. But when you go back in the model and try to understand why that occurred, it was why. It's a trophic model. It only looks at predator-prey connections, and balances those. If there's that many predators out there, or if there's so many prey, then the predators can increase to eat the prey. But they don't eat just one thing either, so it's always messy, right? And things eat them also. So little baby blue crabs are getting eaten by other things in the model also.
So
it's
Tom, like,
messy, but
yeah.
that was the end result. Is there was a disproportionate benefit to blue crab population.
Well, you all saw that horrendogram, that horrendous, like all those lines going all over the place in that trophic model of an oyster reef. So messy is definitely a way to describe it. I see this next comment, I don't know who, by Sumner at Verizon.net. I like the spirit of it. Wow, my son often heads to Man-O-War Shoal for rock. I guess I should let him know they're not there statistically. I think that's awesome. So, and again, you know, going back to the food, like in the model, Tom is manipulating the oysters and then the filter feeders and changing that across scenarios. And then that's, you know, little big things eat little things. That's how economists put these ecological models. And then you have some certain outcome, right? So now whether the rockfish are orienting to the structure, or, you know, there's some kind of attractive versus like production related component here. The models are abstractions from reality, and our model is an abstraction of reality along a lot of dimensions. We also don't account for changes in fisher behavior and say entry and exit into the system when there's a lot more blue crab. So people are going to be coming from outside the chop tank region and hitting those blue crab, and that's going to change things as well. So that's why, like, even when we have decimal points in our economic impact figures, it makes me a little nervous, and this is kind of funny in some sense too, because 22.8, 21.9, 17.4. The takeaway is that this restoration, our model shows, has the potential to have some pretty substantial regional economic impacts. We're not going to bet the house on it as $22.8 million, but you know, that it benefits, the impacts could be large, and that's the takeaway.
It is really an important aspect that the human dimension of this is not part of the model.
And it's difficult. It's just difficult to account for. We're connecting the ecological model, which has its own assumptions and challenges, with an economic model, which has its own assumptions and challenges. So it's important not to get lost in the decimals and the fine print, and just remember, well, what are the magnitudes and what are the directions, and also, like, let's track chop tank harvest. We got it. It's on. Tom and I need to, now that this project's a couple years in the past, we can go back and see, well, are we seeing some of these changes? And, you know, comparing the chop tank harvest relative to harvest and say the Potomac and the Patuxent and other places, and see if we're seeing some of the things that our model is predicting, right?
Wow.
All right, any other questions for Scott or Tom about this fascinating study and research that is continuing, that our policymakers and also folks in the management community will be using to guide some decisions that they're going to be making, and recommendations that they'll be putting forth for helping our bay and also our economy. I think one of the parts is you don't have to give up one for the other. You can have a healthy bay and a healthy economy.
Can I ask you real quick, like the animals on the wall behind you, do you have a Sika deer behind you?
I don't know if that's a cicadere. Yes, it might be.
Okay.
That's at the.
That's
at
a
the,
that's a new that's a new economics project at the Pearl Laboratory. We're looking at hunter spending and economic impacts associated with cicadere in Dorchester County. Yeah.
Well,
Cool.
when we're back open, I want you to all come back and visit us here in Overly and take a look at all the specimens we have and our collections down in the basement.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. Yeah.
Thank you, Tom and Scott, for sharing. And I think that I'm echoing what Sue said. Thank you for sharing your research with us. It's always exciting to understand what the current research is going on there, and this gives us a really different perspective of ecology and the natural history, and also gives us some really good ways to talk to some folks who might be, I don't know, kind of have a preconceived notion of why or why not restoration is a good thing or not. So we have some more arsenal in our toolkit to talk to them about. Everybody, thank you for being here, and we hope to see you next week on Must Learn Thursday, and it is going to be National Rock Collecting Day, so get those cards in the mail if you haven't already. Hallmark holiday of National Collect Rocks Day, and join us here next Thursday with Martin Schmidt to learn how Maryland rocks. Thank you all, and stay safe, stay well, stay curious. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Nice meeting you. I'll
Thank you.
see ya.
Take care.